Hi and welcome back to yet another video from the Norway Chess Tournament. Today we're going to be looking at the game between world champion Magnus Carlsen and candidate Timur Radjabov. This game was played in round 3 and I think we should just jump right into it. So Magnus he decided to go for 1d4. Personal experience says that this move is best by test. We saw knight f6, c4, e6. And here, Magnus deciding to avoid the Nimzo Indian, which would arise after the moves knight c3 and bishop b4. Instead, Magnus going for knight f3, d5 and g3. Magnus here going for the Catalan, which was also played in the World Championship match, where he played against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Radjabov playing bishop e7. So far, it is still mainline theory. Bishop g2, castles, and d takes c4. Now there are a few different ways that white can play in this position, but Magnus going for queen c2. This is also the main line. And in this position, a6 is by far the main move. The point of a6 is that when white takes back the pawn on c4, black will go b5, attacking the queen, which is forced to move again. The queen moves back to c2 and bishop b7. This allows black for some easy development, but white still has some good central pawns. There is a lot of theory in this position, but we won't go any further than this. Instead of a6, Radjabov he did decide to go for the lesser known b5. The point of b5 is that it does not lose an exchange, it does not lose a pawn, because after knight e5 opening up for the bishop, black simply has knight d5, just blocking the bishop completely. Instead, white is trying to take immediate action, trying to undermine the pawns here on the queen side with the move a4. Black doesn't want to take this pawn because then the pawn structure is seriously messed up. This wouldn't be a good way to go at all. Instead, the idea of this b5 move is actually not to keep the pawn, but instead counter-sacrifice a pawn. Radjabov here played the move bishop b7, making sure that he's getting his pieces developed. Magnus took a pawn on b5, and then the move a6. If we count the material here, we can see that black has 7 pawns, white also has 7 pawns, but after it takes on a6, which was played in the game, knight takes a6 and queen takes c4, white is actually up a pawn. This idea of sacrificing the pawn for black first arose on higher level chess in 2020 in the game between Darius Svirts and Christopher Yu. In that game, it was an online game, but in that game, Svirts did not play b takes a6. Instead, he played knight c3. He also won a pawn, but the game was eventually a draw. These were just the first moves being played, with the c4 pawn being able to get picked up later. Now, instead, in the game, as I said, we saw b takes a6, knight takes a6, and queen takes c4. Now, this queen is very annoying on c4, it's very active, so it's quite normal that black in this position plays bishop to d5, just kicking the queen away and trying to take some control over the light squares here in the center. The queen drops back to c3. It could also have gone to c2, but that would allow for the very annoying knight b4, a very active move, allowing black to trade a lot of pieces. Because the rook on a1 is hanging, white is forced to play the move rook takes a8, knight takes c2, rook takes d8, and rook takes d8. Though white is still a pawn up in this position, black has good drawing chances, as a lot of pieces have been traded, and black is also very, very active. Instead, queen c3 was played from Magnus, just trying to not allow these more active moves, and the move c5 came on the board. The point of this move is for black to trade some more pawns. When you're down material, what you usually want to do is trade pawns, and when you're up material, what you usually want to do is trade pieces. c5 here is trying to trade pawns. Now is the time that Magnus he actually played a novelty in this position. He played bishop to f4. Radjabov decided to reply with some active moves, knight e4 kicking the queen away from the c3 square. The queen went to c1. Once again, we don't want to allow any queen c2 active moves like knight b4. So instead, the queen had to go all the way back to c1. The pawns, they were traded on d4. And In this position, Rajabov, he made an inaccuracy. He played the move knight e to c5. But before we go down and look further into this move, let's take a moment to assess the position we have on the board. So material-wise, white is up a pawn. So what we're trying to look for now is where is the compensation for black. As we can see, both the white and the black king, they are pretty safe. Besides that, the pawn structure is quite even, with the main difference being this extra pawn for white here on b2. So where is the compensation then? Well, the compensation in this position lies in the activity of the black pieces. We can see that black is fully developed and has pieces in the center. This bishop and this knight, they're doing very, very well. It's not as easy for white to coordinate their pieces. All of these pieces, they are still on the first rank, just waiting to get out. In this position, Rajabov, he should have played to his strength. He should have tried to activate his pieces even further to put white under a bit of pressure. A move like knight b4 here does allow the trade of rooks, but we can see now all these black pieces are on white's territory. This rook on f8 is ready to go to the c8 square. And here black has a lot of compensation with his activity. Instead, Rajabov, he tried to exchange some pieces with the move knight e to c5, still leaving this knight on a6 on the rim. This was actually also the first time in the game where Magnus, he decided to sit down and think. In all the other moves, he had been moving fairly quickly. He ended up playing bishop takes d5, exchanging these two light squared bishops. This makes a lot of sense because the dark bishop here on d5, it is a very, very strong piece for the black side. It's just looking down at all these light squares, and even though the white bishop is a good defender, it's also good to trade some of your opponent's active pieces. Besides that, if Rajabov here decides to take with the pawn, we can see that his pawn structure is getting ruined here. The pawns, they're getting disconnected. So instead he has to take with the queen, and this allows for Magnus to develop his pieces with tempo, gaining time, being able to coordinate his pieces better. Magnus decided to play the move bishop e3, deciding that the bishop is better on this diagonal than it is on this diagonal. A part of this is that he wants to create a little bit of a pressure on this knight on c5 in case this knight on a6 ever disappeared. Now, when Carlsen, he was in the Chess24 studio, he did give quite a few variations in this position exactly. So his main move that he was considering was this move bishop to f6, where his idea was to play knight c3, chasing the queen away. The queen had a few different places it could go, but I think a variation he showed was very, very cute, where he said that there's one thing he should look out for in this position. And that is after the move queen d7, if he here goes rook d1. Now black can take this knight on d4 with the move bishop takes d4, and it is very tempting to take back with the rook, attacking the black queen here on d7. But after the move queen b7, white is actually in huge trouble, because there is no way to stop this knight b3, which would be a fork to the white pieces. And Magnus is not able to save all these pieces at once. This was just one of the variations he was giving. He did say that in this position he doesn't have to take back with the rook. He can also take back with the bishop. And after the move knight b3 in this position, we have some crazy lines arising after bishop takes g7, which releases an attack against the black queen and breaks up the entire black king side. Knight c1, rook d7, knight e2, check, and knight takes e2. In the end, white would end up getting into an endgame with a pawn more, and I think we can be fairly certain that Magnus, he would be able to convert this position. Instead, in the game, Rajabov, he decided to go for the move queen b7. And now, since the queen is not on d5 anymore, Magnus decided that it was better to develop his knight on b1 to the d2 square, keeping an extra eye out on the b3 square, and also maybe having potential of getting the knight to c4 or the knight to f3 and later on to e5. Besides that, it wasn't possible for him to go to c3, because after knight c3, e5, this knight on d4 is the only one protecting from the knight b3 fork, And when e5 is played, the knight has to move, and then there's no way to stop this knight to b3. So after Magnus played knight d2, Timur decided to get his pieces into play. Rook 8 to c8 is looking down at the queen on c1, so Magnus moved it to b1. Timur here played knight b4. The knight on a6 wasn't very well placed, and it also needs to get into play. Magnus playing knight 4 to f3. He's anticipating that this rook on f8 really wants to go to d8, and he doesn't want any trouble to happen along the d file. Queen b5 on the board, looking down at this pawn on e2, which was defended with the move rook to e1. Timur developed his last rook, rook fd8, and now Magnus playing a little bit of an ugly move, the move king f1. He said in the Chess24 studio that the point of this move was that he didn't really see many other good plans than putting this rook on c1, and to do that he actually has to protect his pawn on e2, because if he puts the rook on c1 immediately, well, then queen takes e2 would just be hanging a pawn. So instead, king f1, and Timur now decided to make some waiting moves, just try to see what it is Magnus does. Rook c1, the plan Magnus had been playing for, bishop f8, once again waiting, and knight e4. Now is the time that Magnus, he goes forward on the board, and he also tries to exchange pieces, because every time Magnus exchanges more pieces, then this pawn becomes stronger and stronger. As mentioned earlier, you really want to trade pieces when you're ahead in material, and the reason for this can be shown if we remove all the pieces from the board. Now, as you can see, I have decided to move all of the pieces from the board, but I haven't changed the pawn structure at all. And this just shows that we are now in a pawn endgame. But because white has this extra outside passed pawn, this is a fairly easy win for someone of their strength. Timur in this position decided to go for the move knight b3, but this just allowed for even more trades. We saw a trade on c8, and now the move knight c3, attacking the queen on b5, which was forced to move. Radjabov decided to move it back to b7. Here, Magnus in the Chess24 studio, he showed some quite funny variations. If Magnus in this position had decided to play the move rook a7, there is a winning move for black. I suggest that you pause this video and try to figure it out for yourself. The winning move for black in this position is the move knight d2, forking the king and the queen. Now here, if white decides to take it with the bishop, then the rook on a7 is no longer protected by the bishop that was on e3 before, and if the knight takes on e3, then queen h1 would be a very uncomfortable checkmate. Magnus, he of course saw this, so he didn't go for rook to a7, instead he went for rook to a4. Timur deciding to go back with the knight to d5, we saw a few more trades, and king f1 to g2. The king is a little bit more safe here on the g2 square than it was on the f1 square. Timur moving a little bit around, waiting a little bit for what Magnus does. Magnus decided to activate his rook even further to a7, and now the move g5 from Radjabov. The threat of this move is to play g4, winning the knight on f3 as it is pinned. But this move also leaves the black king on g8 even more weak. Magnus, of course, doesn't fall for these tricks. Queen d3, a counterattack on the knight on b3, so that in case of g4, he can take on b3. And after the trade on f3, he would win a pawn more. So instead, Radjabov moving the knight back to c5, we saw queen c4. Now in case this knight on c5 moves to e4, we would see another trade, and now this b pawn is really making a good impression. Timur going out of this kind of pin, but walking into a new one with the bishop here on e3. We saw queen a2, protecting the rook on a7, also possibly looking at some b4 ideas. It is very important here, if you're black, to not play the move e5, as we see this rook on a7 being incredibly active, and the queen also a long-range piece pointing towards the black king. Queen takes f7, king h8, and queen h7 would be a mate. Radjabov in this position instead trying to go for the move queen c6, renewing this threat of g4, but it was too little too late. b4, a counterattack on the knight. The knight had to draw back, and now b5. If the black queen here on c6 decides to take the pawn on b5, then this knight on d7 is in trouble after the move knight d4. There is no good place for the queen to go where it can still defend the knight on d7. The move like queen d5 would allow a trade and for white to pick up the knight on d7. Radjabov instead tried to go for queen d6, but after queen a6, he just simply resigned. This queen on a6 is attacking the rook on c8, and Magnus, besides that, is also looking for a queen trade. If we saw queen takes a6 and b takes a6, this pawn here on a6 is very, very close to promotion, and there is no good way of stopping it. If you have any questions or any feedback, please don't forget to leave a comment down below. Other than that, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I of course hope to see you back in the next one.